The real history of money, a 4,000 years pattern. Most of us grew up with a tidy explanation for where money came from. Before it existed, people bartered directly, swapping chickens for bread until the process became too clumsy and someone invented money to smooth it out. It's a clean story and it's in most school textbooks. The problem is that for a century, researchers looking for a society that actually worked this way have never found one. The barter origin story is essentially a myth. Money's real origins are darker than that. And once you trace its actual path through history, a repeating pattern emerges. A form of money is created, people learn to trust it, those in power gradually hollow out its value, and it eventually collapses. Shells, coins, paper, gold, and the currency we use today have all followed this same cycle. Tracing that cycle from the beginning leads somewhere most people wouldn't expect. Debt before coins. Long before coins or shells existed as currency, communities kept track of obligations. If you helped a neighbor repair their roof, they didn't pay you on the spot, they simply owed you, and that debt was settled later, maybe with a sack of grain. That mutual bookkeeping, not a physical object, was arguably the first form of money, a shared memory of who owed what to whom. Records from temples in ancient Mesopotamia show debts being tracked in silver as far back as 5,000 years ago, well before actual coins existed. In other words, money wasn't originally invented to make trading more convenient. It was invented to keep score. And the moment you can keep score, the system becomes something people can manipulate. Everything that follows in monetary history is really just new methods of rigging that score, from shells and stones to standardized coins. As settlements grew into cities, informal memory-based systems became too large to manage socially, so people turned to physical objects that everyone agreed held value. Cattle, salt, giant immovable stone discs on the island of Yap, and cowrie shells, which became one of the most widely circulated currencies in history across Africa and Asia. These all worked for one simple reason: scarcity. But scarcity is easy to break. When outside traders flooded a region with shells from elsewhere, the local currency could collapse almost overnight. The specific object kept changing, but the underlying vulnerability never did. A more durable fix appeared around 600 BC in the kingdom of Lydia, in present-day Western Turkey. Lydian rivers carried electrum, a naturally occurring gold-silver alloy. But since purity varied piece to piece, nobody could agree on its worth. The Lydian kings solved this by melting it down, standardizing the weight and purity, and stamping each piece with a royal seal, a guarantee from the king himself. People no longer needed to weigh or test each piece. They simply trusted the face stamped on it. This was the first true coinage, and it spread across the ancient world within 2 centuries. But it also marked something new. For the first time, money physically carried a ruler's image, fusing political power and currency into a single object, a temptation no ruler since has fully resisted. Rome perfects the art of debasement. Rome turned that temptation into a repeatable technique. The Roman denarius began as a trustworthy, nearly pure silver coin under Augustus. But funding an empire is costly, and emperors discovered a trick that felt like magic. Collect silver coins through taxation, melt them down, mix in cheap copper, and restamp the alloy at the original face value. The result was more coins in circulation than existed before. Money effectively created out of nothing. Each successive emperor debased the currency a bit further. By 270 AD, a denarius that once was almost pure silver contained barely 5% silver. It looked the same and carried the same stamped value, but it was mostly worthless metal. Romans weren't fooled forever. As prices rose, people began hoarding the older, purer coins and spending the newer, debased ones. The empire effectively inflated its currency into a crisis, and its money collapsed well before Rome itself did. Rome wasn't the last government to try this. It was simply the first to do it on such a large scale. China's leap to paper money. While Rome was shaving down its coins, China took a different path entirely. Carrying heavy strings of copper coins was impractical, so merchants began depositing their coins with trusted shops in exchange for paper receipts. By the 11th century, the Song dynasty government issued the world's first official paper currency, and for a time it worked remarkably well. After the Mongol conquest, Kublai Khan made paper money the sole legal currency across his empire, backed by nothing but his authority. When the traveler Marco Polo encountered it, he described the Khan as having mastered a kind of alchemy, turning ordinary paper into wealth. But paper carries the same weakness coins do, only easier to exploit. You have to physically melt down a coin to debase it, but paper can simply be printed in unlimited quantities. As successive emperors printed more and more, the currency's value collapsed so badly that the following Ming dynasty eventually abandoned paper money altogether and returned to metal coinage. Different empire, different material, but the same ending Rome had already lived through. The Medici and the birth of financial networks. For most of history, money was a physical thing that stayed in one place. Renaissance Italy changed that, turning currency into something that could move and multiply on its own. The Medici family of Florence built their fortune not through mining or conquest, but through a financial instrument called the bill of exchange. Because the Catholic Church banned charging interest on loans as sinful usury, the Medici disguised interest as currency exchange. A merchant would deposit funds in Florence and withdraw an equivalent sum months later in London in a different currency, with the bank's profit quietly built into the exchange rate, effectively alone with the sin hidden from view. Using this method, the Medici Bank financed popes, funded kings, and helped bankroll the Renaissance itself. Money had stopped being something you could simply count in your hand. It had become an invisible, fast-moving network, and the harder money became to see directly, the easier it became to quietly erode its value. Anchoring money to gold and cutting the rope. For centuries afterward, nations tried to tie their currencies to something rulers couldn't fake: gold. Under this system, every banknote represented a promise. Bring it to a bank, and you could exchange it for a fixed amount of gold, meaning a country's money supply was directly limited by how much gold it actually held. Britain pioneered this approach, and by the late 1800s, most major trading nations had adopted the gold standard, which brought decades of relatively stable prices. But gold has a hard ceiling, and wartime spending regularly exceeds what any gold reserve can support. During the First World War, country after country quietly suspended the gold standard and printed money as needed, revealing that the gold anchor was only ever honored when convenient. Germany showed the world what happens when that restraint disappears entirely. Crushed by reparations, debt after losing World War I, Germany printed money continuously to keep up, and by 1923 its currency had effectively broken. Prices doubled every couple of days. A loaf of bread that cost a few marks before the war cost hundreds of billions of marks by year's end. People reportedly burned stacks of banknotes for warmth because the paper was cheaper than firewood. And an entire nation's savings were wiped out within months. It was the same cycle Rome and China had lived through, just compressed into months instead of centuries, and the devastation it left behind helped set the stage for another world war. Bretton Woods and the dollar's rise. After World War II, the world needed a new monetary framework. In 1944, delegates from 44 nations met at a hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, and agreed on a new arrangement. The US dollar would be pegged to gold at $35 an ounce, and every other currency would be pegged to the dollar. In effect, the world stopped trusting gold directly and instead trusted America's promise to hold enough gold to back the system. This was the moment the dollar quietly became the anchor of the global monetary system, resting entirely on the assumption that the US would always keep sufficient gold reserves to honor its promise. That arrangement held for roughly 25 years. By the late 1960s, the United States was simultaneously funding the Vietnam War and expensive domestic programs, sending far more dollars into global circulation than it had gold to back. France began demanding actual gold in exchange for its dollar holdings, and U.S. gold reserves started draining rapidly. On August 15, 1971, President Nixon announced on television that the dollar would no longer be convertible into gold. He described the move as temporary. It turned out to be permanent. With that single announcement, the last connection between money and any physical backing was severed. For the first time in history, the world's currency system was backed by nothing but trust in the governments issuing it. This is what's known as pure fiat money, currency that has value simply because a government declares it does and for no other underlying reason. The cash in your wallet isn't a claim on gold or on anything else. It holds value only because everyone around you agrees to keep treating it as valuable. Unlimited supply, shrinking value. Once currency is no longer tied to a physical resource, there's no natural ceiling on how much of it can be created. A government can generate more at will, essentially with a keystroke. Since Nixon severed the dollar's link to gold, the US dollar has lost more than 80% of its purchasing power. The number printed on a banknote never changes, but what that note can buy keeps shrinking year after year. It's the same maneuver Roman and Chinese emperors once used to quietly drain their currencies. Modern economies just gave it a more technical name: monetary policy. 2008 and the question that followed. This system held for decades until 2008. In the years leading up to the crisis, banks had packaged millions of risky home loans into financial products marketed as safe investments, then piled enormous bets on top of them. When U.S. housing prices stopped climbing, the entire structure collapsed. In September 2008, Lehman Brothers, a bank that had survived more than 150 years, failed within a single weekend. For several days, it looked like the global financial system might seize up entirely, and the rescue response revealed the true nature of fiat money. Governments and central banks generated trillions of new dollars out of nothing to bail out the very banks that had caused the crisis. Those who had taken the financial risks were rescued, while the broader public absorbed the cost through years of eroded savings. Millions of ordinary people lost homes and jobs while watching the institutions responsible get bailed out with freshly created money. Understandably, a lot of people walked away from 2008 asking a pointed question: why should we trust these institutions with our money at all? An answer called Bitcoin. That question was already being answered while the crisis was still unfolding. On October 31st, 2008, someone using the pseudonym Satoshi Nakamoto published a short technical paper describing a new form of money called Bitcoin, currency with no government, no bank, and no central authority controlling it. Instead of trusting an institution, users would trust a shared public ledger maintained simultaneously by thousands of computers worldwide, one that no single party could secretly alter. In a way, it was a return to money's original concept, a record of who owes what to whom, except this version answered to no king or emperor, and its supply was mathematically capped at 21 million coins, meaning no one could ever print more. When Satoshi launched the network in January 2009, the very first block contained a hidden reference to a newspaper headline about bank bailouts. For the first time in 10,000 years, here was a form of money that those in power couldn't quietly debase. At least, that was the intention. Governments respond: digital currencies of their own. Power rarely surrenders control over money willingly. As digital currencies gained traction, governments drew their own conclusion. If money is moving toward digital form, they wanted their own version of it, a central bank digital currency, or CBDC. This is simply a country's official currency issued directly in digital form by its central bank. On the surface, it sounds convenient and harmless, but physical cash is inherently private, while a state-issued digital currency is not. Every transaction can potentially be monitored and tracked, and because the currency is programmable, it can also be restricted, set to expire if unspent within a certain period, or blocked from being used for certain purchases. China has already begun rolling out its digital yuan to hundreds of millions of citizens, and more than 100 other countries are exploring similar systems of their own. Two futures, one choice. Money began purely as a way to keep score between people. That underlying pattern hasn't disappeared. It's still playing out today, in decisions being made far outside public view. Broadly, the future of money seems to be narrowing toward two possibilities. One version has no central owner and a hard, unchangeable supply limit. The other can be tracked down to the last cent, switched off, or restricted in what it can be used for, entirely at the discretion of whoever controls it. One of these models is likely to become dominant, potentially within the next decade, and most people won't get much say in which one wins. Across 10,000 years, money has never been just a neutral tool for trade. It has always quietly shaped who holds power over whom, from ancient Rome to the negotiating rooms of 1944. The people who tend to understand that best are rarely the ones simply holding the money. As the next major shift in how currency works arrives, the same question that has followed every previous era resurfaces: who ends up holding the controls? This document is a paraphrased summary of ideas presented in an online video about the history of money, from ancient debt records through coinage, paper currency, the gold standard, fiat money, and modern digital currencies. It is intended as a general historical overview, not financial advice.